Welcome everyone to the Stormbirds Podcast. This is episode 3, and today we're going to be talking about DCS World War II. This is an area of the flight sim experience that doesn't get as much attention, in my opinion, as some of the other parts of the DCS experience or flight simming in general, but it is an interesting part of that tapestry. To discuss this subject, I thought I would bring in someone to the podcast who's very familiar with the DCS World War II. This is Phil from Philstyle's YouTube channel. He has 450 videos with a lot of DCS World War II content, some X-Plane, and some other flight sim material on there as well. Without further ado, Phil, please introduce yourself.
450 videos, that surprises me. I've actually deleted some recently because I was just looking back at some of the older material and some of it's really, really poor, so I'll have to do that again. My real name is Phil, surprisingly not, which is also the name I use on the YouTube channel. I've just hit my 40s, and I've been playing, let's say, flying games since about 1990, 1991, way back when I was in, I guess you would call it middle school, pre kind of junior high or whatever you call it in the States if you're an American audience. For us in New Zealand, it was called intermediate school, and I remember going around to my friend's place, probably the only guy in the neighborhood that had a computer, and playing Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe and seeing that for the first time as like a 10-year-old kid. And I remember going home and being unable to sleep because I was so amazed that this guy could, let's say, fly an airplane on his computer. Looking back at it now, it obviously looks horrifically dated. It's 2D, 16 colors or something. But at the time, those images just got burned into my brain of this clunky 2D flight. We can't really call it a flight sim, but it was as good as he had back then. And so ever since then, I just had this horizon line with the green below and the blue above kind of stuck in my mind. And I've always associated that with something fun and something kind of fantastic from when I was this 9-10-year-old kid. I didn't really do any simming of my own until I was a late teenager, early 20s. I read as a teenager loads and loads of autobiographies because my grandfather, who passed when I was only 1, left quite a big collection of Second World War semi-historical books, autobiographies and things like that. They're not really hardcore history books, but they were written by people who served and, recollecting the events as best as they could of the war. So things like Reach for the Sky by Paul Brickhill, that's the biography of Douglas Bader. The Dam Busters, also by the same author. I read Johnny Johnson's Wing Leader a number of times, and I still read that maybe once every 2 or 3 years. So during my teens, I kind of had this attachment with historical literature of these pilots. And then sometime in my late mid-teens, I discovered Aces Over Europe and Aces Over the Pacific. Those 2 games were really cool. I can kind of say they were the first 3D flight sims, but they weren't really. They were still, pretty 2D. And there's a particular engine tone. This is really bizarre, but there's a particular engine tone from the British aircraft in that game. And I'm a bit musical. I played piano kind of as a teenager as well. And I found that the major fourth is the same as the engine tone from those aircraft. So just one time playing along as a kid, and I hit a chord as a major fourth, I think an F major fourth, F in the bottom and a B flat at the top. Quite low, about 2 octaves below middle C on the piano, for those who are musical. And that tone is almost the exact same tone as the aircraft tone in this old 1990s computer game. So it's clear to me that this computer gaming I did as a early teenager, mid-teenager, some of the imagery and some of the audio really was stuck in my brain growing up. And it's just something I couldn't shake. I couldn't shake this literature that I was reading, and I couldn't shake these early flying games. And so when IL-2 1946 came along and the global multiplayer thing happened, which is probably 15 years ago now. I can't recall exactly.
Yeah,
but
it is, because I think it got really big say 2003 and on, like from
Yes.
there, I feel it exploded, right?
Yeah. That must have been about it when I was involved. Maybe a little bit later, a year or two for me later. But I remember jumping on to IL2, connecting with this global multiplayer community. And Hyper Lobby was huge. Everyone was on Hyper Lobby. And the whole thing was just completely mad. There were thousands and thousands of people playing. And that got me hooked. Got me hooked on World War II multiplayer. It got me hooked on that generation of IL2. And it kind of connected all those childhood images and all those childhood sounds with this new kind of internet-based gaming. So that's kind of my history. I was then involved heavily with Cliffs of Dover. I absolutely loved Cliffs. It was light years ahead of everything else when it came out. It was probably too good, to be honest. It was probably too PC heavy and too GPU heavy for what hardware we all had at the time. And by the time our hardware had caught up with Cliffs of Dover, it started feeling dated. But we ran a server, me and a couple of other guys, the Storm of War server in Cliffs for a number of years. And we tried really hard to build an immersive environment where people would fly the way people flew back in the 1940s, not because we made rules that forced them to, but just because the environment was set up in such a way that if they flew as the guys flew back in the 1940s, they would have more success. They would be more successful than if they didn't. So just flying around at low level in ones and twos doing dogfighting would not yield the best results because the environment was set up in a way that escorting bombers or forming up and with large groups and conducting interceptions would actually yield the best results and the most fun. So that was the Storm of War that we ran in the Cliffs of Dover, and then kind of Cliffs started. It's a bit harsh to use the word dying, but Cliffs of Dover came to a transition period where I think people realized that it was on its last legs. Development officially ceased, and the community had to start picking up the loose ends. It was all very messy. It was about that time that IL2, the current IL2, Great Battles, was on the cards, was being developed and starting to be released, and that was also about the same time that DCS was dabbling into World War II as well. I think the Mustang and either the 109 or the Dora, right, were the first Warbirds. Yeah, I can't quite remember which one was first. I came after those very first Warbirds had been released. I was still very much clinging on to Cliffs of Dover. I was incredibly reluctant to leave Cliffs. I was a member of a virtual squadron, and 2 or 3 guys were really keen on DCS, and I was not. I was so reluctant. I did not want to fly jets. I was dead set against flying jets. I didn't see the appeal. I mean, and now that I've explained my history, right, this kind of childhood and teenage years, what I was into, you can see why the jets didn't appeal. It didn't have this kind of fantasy emotional attachment for me, and I didn't see the World War II offering as being anywhere near satisfactory that DCS had, so I didn't want to do it. Eventually, I just think kind of coincidentally, a couple of guys just said, let's just jump on and have a fly of the Mustang or something and see what it's like. I did, and it was okay. I could see the big jump in terms of the flight handling and the characteristics of the aeroplanes, but the rest was all missing, right? There was no real cohesive World War II environment. The damage modeling, even still now in 2020, wasn't there. It just wasn't appealing, and it took me a long time to really get convinced to spend more time in DCS. It wasn't until they released the Spitfire and I flew the Mark 9. When that came out and I flew that Mark 9 Spit for the first time, then I was sold. And I don't know what it was about it, because the rest of the sim was still lacking, right? It was still DCS 1.5. It still looked okay at the time, a little bit basic. There weren't any really immersive server environments. It was still just dogfighting, but there was something about the way they'd put that Mark 9 together. it just had this momentum about it. The way the engine behaved, the Merlin, the responsiveness of it, the aerobatic kind of handling characteristics, the stall characteristics. I don't know why, but something just sold me on that airplane. And then I started investing a lot of time in it. And once I had invested a lot of time in it and becoming familiar, then I was in, right? The hook was in my mouth, and I was a DCS World War II player. So this whole process was, 3 or 4 years, from being very, very reluctant to being pretty happy and convinced. So yeah, that's where I spend the most of my simming time now, is in DCS World War II.
And so for you, it really was that the release of the Spitfire module into it that really sort of cemented it for you.
Yeah, I think if they hadn't have released that Spit, I probably would still not be a DCS World War II player. I doubt there's another module that could have convinced me. Now that I am there, I do love the other modules. And we can talk a little bit about that later, perhaps. But to get me there, it took the Spitfire. And all of the other modules they've developed since, had they developed those and not the Spit, I probably still would not have made the jump. So I can't be sure.
It's kind of that emotional connection to the plane, right? Like, I mean, so I'm Canadian, and the Spitfire is certainly part of Canadian military history, and so yeah, when I went and looked at DCS World War II modules, the first one I bought was the Spit Mark 9 as well. So, and that's what got me in too. So I find that fascinating.
I think it is. I think if I'd been North American or US American, I think I would have probably gone earlier with the Mustang. It's just one of those things. And I think there is, perhaps more than we'd care to admit, so much emotion and kind of imagination tied into all this stuff. I think we like to think of ourselves as rather clinical and discerning customers, but we're so easily won over by emotional appeal.
For sure. Slap a British roundel on there and we'll buy it. Yeah. That's great. So I think you kind of answered one of my questions, follow-up questions, which was the Storm War DCS multiplayer server and sort of how it got started. And I think you were kind of saying you were part of. Was it a group, or was it just you that started it in the Cliffs of Dover days and then migrated it over to DCS World? Is that how it went?
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated. So I was part of a virtual squadron, right? Everyone knows or most people know what they are. And there was this other chap, this guy called Faber, who was also a member of another virtual squadron. I think he was part of ACG. The combat group, who still exists and is still a pretty, strong,
very well organized,
well-known group. Yeah. He was part of that group, and he had a server machine, and he started hosting events, weekly events, and he would invite virtual squadrons along. And I think the bulk of the participants to begin with were ACG squads, and over time they opened up this event stuff to other squadrons. And my squadron that I was a part of back then got involved, and then over time the Storm of War name got attached to it. I don't know how this happened, but it disassociated itself from ACG over time. And I think Faber individually then took over or established it as his thing as opposed to an ACG. It was, I don't know, maybe there was politics, maybe there was just, who knows, but you know how it goes with this stuff, right? It's fluid and things migrate and names get attached and then they disappear. Over time, what it effectively became was this weekly event where squadrons would get together, we would battle against each other, and then during the week he would do all this tallying up or whatever, and the next week the next mission would come along and we'd go at it again. After some time, I think it became quite a lot of workload for Faber, and another dude, Red Dog, and I, we offered to get involved and support him. So we started helping out with managing this weekly event. And then we started talking about trying to turn it into a persistent thing, whereas we didn't have to do all the tallying up ourselves all the time. We would develop a database and some code, not me, because I've got no idea about that kind of stuff. But the guys who know how to do it would develop some code in a database, and it would talk to Cliffs back and forward, and it would do all the organizing. So all of the campaigny stuff that we were doing manually would happen via code. And then we could run the thing 24/7. Then as time went by, Faber eventually decided he couldn't be involved anymore. He wanted to step away. The workload was too much, various other reasons. So he asked us if we wanted to take over. So Red Dog and I said, sure, we'll take over. And then we took the Storm of War thing off his hands. We bought the server box off him, and we then pursued this kind of 24/7 persistent campaign. So it was a campaign where you would log into the server, you would tell the server whether or not you were a member of a virtual squadron. If you were a member of a virtual squadron, it knew which airfield you operated from. You had a limited number of airplanes for your squadron, and it would track how much aircraft you had, and it would track, your squadron. And you could move to another airfield, but you would have to, submit a request or whatever, and then the team command would change you to a different airfield, and you'd operate from a different field. If you landed in another airfield, you had to ferry your aircraft home. If it was damaged, then you would have to wait like 2 days or whatever, a day before it became available back at your home base. There were German AI bomber raids, which were just constantly coming over and attacking airfields, and they could take them out. So one day you might go on the server and you might find out that your airfield had been bombed to smithereens overnight, and you'd had to operate from an emergency field or wait 2 days before your spawn or your readiness area was back online, and all this complicated offline stuff that was managing what was happening on the server all the time. So we ran that for a few years, and kind of as Cliff started kind of naturally winding down as a online game, there was also just some general, fatigue, let's say, on our behalf. And eventually we decided to stop running that. But we still kept the kind of Storm of War community to a degree. We kept our forums running, and we were just waiting and looking around. And it was about a year and a half before then we started just doing small events in DCS, just like, let's just have a fly with some other guys, the former Cliffs of Dover guys who we know fly DCS. And we would just get together, run some events, and then the same thing happened. Over time, we just thought, well, why don't we just make this a 24/7 server? So it was organic, a slow kind of transition out of Cliffs, and then a slow build up and transition into DCS.
Okay. All right.
So yeah.
And how do things look now? I mean, I actually sort of know the answer to this because I've flown on there a couple of times in preparation and
yeah, so there's
interest. But yeah, how what's it like now?
Well, on the Storm of War side, it's still problematic but positive. On the wider World War II DCS side, the same answer, but they're different issues.
Well, so we can get into each of those.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about both, right? I'll start with Storm of War, I guess. Our principle with Storm of War is just to build the server as we want it. There are two of us involved, a guy Dietrich and I. Dietrich mostly flies on the German side, and he mostly flies ground attack. So he's a very strong focus on making sure that there is a ground attack environment which is as close to kind of his vision for ground attack as possible. I'm historically and primarily an RAF Spitfire guy with a strong focus on air-to-air combat. So I want to make sure that the air-to-air stuff is as strong and kind of matches my vision. So we try to build an environment which suits our play style, which is the way we want to play. And we've always maintained that we should just build the server as we want. And if other people enjoy it, then that's fantastic. Then there'll be a human player base that grows. And if other people don't like it, we will fly it as long as it entertains us. And then once we become not entertained anymore, we'll stop doing it. And so far, the philosophy appears to have worked. We are enjoying our time on the server that we have. We fly on our server very regularly. I think I flew about 45 hours last month. Dietrich flies 20 or 30 hours a month. So we're not distant, non-participating admins. We are regularly flying on the server. And it's entertaining for us. So that's good. There are also about 800 or 900 people who kind of join the server and fly a little bit per month. And there are about 200 or 300 who rack up sort of 10 plus hours per month. So the server tends to hover around sort of 5 to 35 players, which is not a lot, I know, for a lot of other expectations from other games that people have, but it's pretty reasonable for DCS. It's very good for DCS World War II. And there's also the constant AI. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, that's, many of the popular DCS not World War II, but just DCS servers in general. I mean, yeah, hovering around 35 to 40 players is kind of typical. Like that's kind of a good range. And I don't know, I've noticed that most of the DCS servers they start to run into more tech issues once you get above numbers like that anyways. So
yeah, historically that's been the case. I don't know if anyone's really pushing it now because things have improved overall. We capped ours at 40 8 months ago and we've kept it there. I don't really want to increase the cap because I'm worried that as soon as I bump it up it's going to get all unstable. But we haven't really pushed it. And we haven't really needed to. One of the philosophical kind of decisions we've made is that we want to build a server that is for people who don't like multiplayer, which seems a bit odd, but there are a lot of people who love single player. They would like to go on multiplayer, but multiplayer is too different. It's too much of a different environment from single player that a lot of the behaviors and skills they've learned in single player won't necessarily hold them in good stead in the multiplayer environment. And there's another barrier to entry, right? DCS has already got a bit of a steep, or a number of barriers to entry to begin with, let alone then the multiplayer environment where you go and add another layer on top of that. So what we've tried to do is create an environment where someone who does not like multiplayer can join the server and can do something that they feel valuable and they feel engaging, and gives them some entertainment and it gives them some sense of achievement, but it doesn't necessarily feel like their typical multiplayer environment. And what I mean by that, and I don't want to be too denigrating of multiplayer, but I think for a lot of people, the multiplayer experience is jump in, fly, get shot down, and that's it. So we've tried to create this environment where if people take their time, like you kind of would with a single player mission or a single player campaign, take your time, read the briefing, have a think about your flight plan, have a think about where the enemy is likely to be and where humans are likely to be, avoid them, go and carry out a task, return home, and possibly engage only with AI, whether that's ground-based AI or air-based AI. And the AI are carrying out sensible tasks. They're not just there to be shot down. They don't just spawn in when you get within zone X, right? The AI are there doing tasks whether you are engaging with them or not, which is kind of what a good single-player mission does. The environment is alive, and you are there doing your business, and whether or not you engage with hostile aircraft or hostile units is kind of up to you. So that's how we've tried to structure, well, that's part of the decision-making between how we've tried to structure the server, so that it appeals to people who come from a single-player background.
That makes a lot of sense. And if I remember correctly as well, you have it set up on the server so that you can potentially take a wingman, like an AI wingman with you, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so 95% of the spawn points, the aircraft availability is just you, right? You spawn in and you take your aeroplane. However, there are a very limited number of slots, very, very rare at the back of the map, let's say, on either side, where if you spawn, an AI wingman will spawn with you. And so that also is kind of the single player mentality, because most people who play single player are used to spawning in, having an AI wingman. So we do provide that, but that means spawning way back from the front line. And there are very limited slots that provide that, but yeah, it is there.
And is that a kind of a server balance experience consideration or a technical consideration or a bit of both?
There's no real technical consideration, apart from sometimes the AI just take a long time to spool up, taxi, and get airborne, right? So sometimes if you're waiting for your AI wingman, you might have to circle the base a few times, or just get going, start climbing, and he'll catch up. The balancing issue is not really a problem, partly because, for the most part, we don't agree with balance. What I mean by that is we quite happily accept asymmetrical scenarios to a degree. So I think D-Day +1 or D-Day was 15,000 sorties flown by the Allies and about 300 flown by the Luftwaffe. So the historical environment is, or maybe it's 1,000, but it's about 15-1 or 16-1 in favor of the Allies. We're not prepared to go that far, but I don't mind it if there is, a disproportionate number of one side on the server, because that's just the way it is sometimes. And I think DCS is quite open to asymmetrical warfare. And if listening to a recent interview from Nick Gray, actually on Growling Sidewinder's channel, his YouTube channel, Nick explicitly kind of talks about this scenario. The DCS itself is not set up to be balanced. And our server kind of follows that same principle. There are loads of other decisions which come in. We don't want it getting ridiculous, but if it got ridiculous and one side was just completely dominating all the time, then we would actually consider just having a one-sided server. If nobody ever wanted to fly any German aeroplane in DCS, for example, and there was never going to be any blues around, for us blue means Axis, red is Allies. If no one was flying Axis side ever, and there was no way of convincing them to do so, then we would think about just having a PvE server where everyone flies on the Allied side and the computer flies on the German side. Fortunately, we're nowhere near that scenario. The two sides are actually very, very even and very competitive against each other, so it's okay for now.
Yeah, and my experience having popped on there a few times is that, there's usually a good number of people on both sides, and there seems to be kind of a good back and forth, so that's always encouraging to see.
Yeah, there are other things people can do to kind of add force multipliers, and one of them is this ground control function, which in the modern servers is normally called GCI. We have used DCS's built-in JTAC system to allow players to do ground controlling using SRS, which is this third-party radio plugin, which is super. And also SRS now is available for IL2, I understand, as well. It's a super, super plugin. It's very, very handy. So our guys log onto the server, and if your team is outnumbered, say 10-5 or something, acting as a ground controller and providing that human-based fighter control can double your force. It's a really, really important force multiplier. So there are things like that on the server, alongside these AI wingman things. If I'm going on the server and I'm outnumbered by the enemy and I don't mind doing a long flight, I'll take an AI wingman with me. Not necessarily because they're going to shoot guys down, but they're going to get in the way. They're going to split the enemy's attention. And if I get outnumbered, it just helps me, I've got an AI wingman who could potentially shield me for a few seconds.
For sure. No, I think those are all good things that they can help somebody, especially if you don't necessarily have other people, with you, or you don't have them with you at that point. Yeah, you can still go in and have a good multiplayer experience. I know I hopped on and I didn't take the AI wingman, but I very quickly got into contact with the controller, and I didn't feel like I was, flying around alone. He was actually giving me, hey, there's, Bandit over Argenton, and he's headed your way. He's about 15 miles at 20,000 feet. And if you fly this course, you'll intercept him. Fantastic. Like that just kind of, it even though I was flying by myself, I wasn't.
Yeah, that's really important, because feeling alone or being alone in the multiplayer environment I think is pretty scary. And it takes a lot of confidence and a lot of skill, I think, to operate solo, especially air to air. So having someone else effectively in the cockpit with you, a controller, makes for a much more interesting experience. It also takes a lot of workload off a server operator, because in the absence of having someone informing the pilots about what's going on around them, you often have to use in-game messaging systems, right? You fly over a target, or every time something gets attacked, a little message pops up on screen, such and such an airfield is under attack, or enemy aircraft spotted here. And all of that messaging requires that the server owner or the operator has to spend time coding all that stuff into their missions. If you've got a pool of players who also can play as a controller, it takes that burden away. And you've got people sitting there actually telling the pilots what's going on, which is really, really cool.
For sure. And it's much more interactive because it's an actual human who you can ask a question to, and it will, they can give you information back, which is just something that, a scripted system really can't do at the same level, right?
Yeah, you're stuck with a much more limited set of options with scripting. There's one part of the kind of aviation online community which I think it would be great to tap into, and that is all the guys that like doing ATC for the civilian sims.
Yes.
I would love to see some of those guys come over to the combat simming environment to do what they do for the aviation guys, because a lot of them are happy to spend hours controlling civil aviation. I just wonder how much more interesting it would be for them to have a crack at doing some combat controlling. That'd be quite interesting.
Controlling, absolutely. I have actually experienced that in DCS on one of the Hoggett servers not too long ago, and there was someone running as ATC, which was it just adds that extra layer of immersion. So maybe a few more, and come check out the Storm of War server and do some World War II style controlling. That would be fascinating, right?
Yeah, it's really fun to listen to. Some guys go for the full role play immersion, put on a little clipped accent and give you the full. Sometimes it's fantastic. Or sometimes when I'm controlling on the blue side, I use some German as well, and sort of half German, half English sentences and whatnot. It can be really fun.
Absolutely. Why don't we switch over from talking about the server to talking about DCS World War II itself, because that's what underpins all of this at this point. Let's talk positives for starters, because I think both of us could probably point to some issues, but let's talk about some of the real positive things to start off. What are the coolest or the most sort of exciting things that are currently available in DCS World War II, and what, looking forward, are you most excited about? That will, is it content? What are the things that are coming that you think are interesting?
So the current situation, and I think my answer about the Spitfire kind of points to what I find most engaging about DCS, and I find it hard to find the word to describe it, but I'm going to say specificity. And I just found when I jumped in the Spitfire, after having flown the Mustang and the T-51, and after having flown Clod quite extensively and a number of different aircraft in Clod, when I jumped in that DCS Mark 9 Spit, I just found it to be so incredibly specific. And it was like... this sounds like too high praise, and maybe it is. It sounds like I'm just trying to be a bit bullshitty here, but it felt like I was playing a standalone game, and that the money I had spent on the Spitfire, I had bought a Spitfire game, and that if I'd spent that money on the P-51, then I would have bought a P-51 game. I felt like the whole kind of everything around me was specific to this aeroplane I was sitting in, this Mark 9 Spitfire. I didn't feel like I was just flying another in-game aircraft that had a different performance envelope, which is kind of what I was used to in the past, right? I mean, you think back to the Aces over Europe, Aces over the Pacific days, the early kind of IL-2, 1946. Basically what you got is each aircraft had the flight model, not a flight model, but the flight model, right? It was the game flight model, and the parameters were different. I just don't feel like that at all in DCS. I feel like when a new module comes out, it's an entirely new specific thing that I'm going to have to sit down and learn and engage with from the beginning. And so that's what I think is one of their absolute key selling points, USPs, whatever you want to call it. It may not be entirely unique to them, but I think it's something they have to really leverage, is that their aircraft really are incredibly specific. And I just kind of pull all of this into this kind of word specificity. So I really feel like each type in DCS is a type, and then I need to get time on type to be good. Rather than just being good at DCS, I have to learn to be good at each specific type. So that is probably the main thing. Secondly, and this is probably more of a recent thing, is it is incredibly beautiful. DCS is it's ripping gorgeous, especially when you get a little bit of low lighting. One of the biggest disservices I think that DCS does to itself is that almost all of the first interactions you have with it are pretty much midday. So when you just get the game for the first time and you jump in a quick mission, or you just spawn in an airplane, it's midday. The sun's right up in the sky, everything's washed out, and it doesn't show how beautiful it is. And any photographer knows this, right? The best time of the day is soon after dawn and around just before dusk. Exactly, right? And DCS does that so incredibly well. And the golden hours are long in DCS, especially if you get the maps closer to the closer you get to the poles. The sun is swinging around low on the horizon. It's not going up and down like it does at the equator. It's low. It swings along the horizon. You get this incredibly elongated golden hours. The lighting is just ridiculous. The aircraft are beautiful. The light pings off the propellers and off the fuselages, and it's glary at times. The shadows are rich. Inside the cockpits, it's beautiful. Everything about it, the way it looks is stunning. And the new maps are fantastic as well. The channel map is stunning. Normandy is beautiful, but starting to look a little bit dated. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I my first couple of flights over the channel map, and I was pretty much just hanging there with my jaw open because I'm going, wow, this is impressive. Like, and you get down where some of the civilian flight sims in the past have kind of faltered is when you get down low. But I took a P-47 down low over I think I was over Eastbourne or something like that on that map, and wow, just like looking at the hedgerows and the individual details of the buildings, and it's very impressive.
Yeah, I think it's so detailed down low that they've gone a bit far, and I think, and this is a wider topic, but I think combined arms has been problematic for DCS. So this combined arms is the module which allows you to drive and use ground units. And this is perhaps when we move on to the next topic, we'll go into detail about my thoughts on combined arms. But I think combined arms has had an unfortunate effect of defocusing parts of DCS away from what matters, which is the aviation connected stuff. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful. I mean, in France, there are those little kiosk things with newspaper articles on them, and you can just about read the newspaper articles. It's absolutely ridiculous. Cobblestone streets and wheelbarrows in people's back gardens. So,
yeah. No, it's extremely detailed. So, so those are all some of the sort of very encouraging things. I guess maybe before we move on, I'm pretty excited to see the Mosquito come later in the year. I think that will be kind of a nice thing to have. Have a twin-engined attack or perhaps intercept kind of oriented aircraft away from the pure fighter. I think that's going to be very interesting to have in DCS World War II.
Yeah, No, absolutely. That is the only other airplane I think that could really take my heart. I mean, for me, the Mosquito is basically the Spitfire in twin engine form. I mean, it's so gorgeous. It has those same kind of lines, and it's iconic for me in the way that the Spitfire is. It's a big project. I mean, it's a twin engine prop. DCS has never done a flyable twin prop before. If they intend to do it with the level of specificity, there's that word again, that they've done with the other modules, I can imagine it would be a massive, massive job. I'm guessing, I don't know, but I don't think we're going to see it this year.
Well, I mean, Nick in that interview on with Growling Sidewinder, it seemed to indicate that it was coming this year.
Yeah, I know. Everything's 2 weeks away, isn't it? They have to do it properly. They have to do it right. Okay, if they have to do it right, it has to be a whole thing unto itself. Like I talked about with the Spitfire, when you get that Mosquito, if you buy it and you get in it, you have to feel like you've just purchased a whole new DCS, not just another aeroplane to put in your hangar. You have to think, I've just bought myself 2 years of gaming for $60 or 50 quid or whatever. So that's how they have to get it. They basically have to be releasing, and that's how I kind of think of DCS modules. I kind of think of each module as an entirely new game. Others would disagree with me, and it might be that I'm projecting my own kind of my own desires and whatever onto the product there. But I think that's the philosophy they have to aim for, that when you buy a module, you're buying a whole new game. And there's commercial reasons for that. They're competing against other platforms who give you multiple modules or multiple aircraft in one go for the same price. So if you're not buying a whole new game when you're spending $40 or $50, then you're not really getting value for money in comparison. Because you can buy a whole game for 40 or 50 euros or $40, $50.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. They need to make sure that there's enough there that you feel that money was worth, spending, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it will be. I'm pretty sure that it's going to be, at least within the DCS world, it'll be game-changing. Maybe it'll be game-changing across the combat sim environment. That's probably a big claim. But, I'm really looking forward to the Mosquito. I will be very keen to try it. If it's good, if it's as good as the Spit is to Spitfires, then I will make it probably my primary ride. Yeah. There's nothing that could convince me more to be a ground attack guy than a Mosquito.
Yeah, well, like I said, it could be a very exciting and an aircraft with a different role than some of the ones that we've seen so far for the series. So, maybe this is a good sort of segue into talking about the variety and some of the challenges with DCS World War II. And maybe the question, I think the question I want to ask you is, what's the thing that's stopping people getting into it, in your opinion? What's the thing that's stopping them get into it and then get into multiplayer? That's a pretty broad and open topic, but let's talk about some of the challenges.
From what I read around the place, and this is not an issue for me, but it's clearly something that's raised time and time again by a lot of players. And there are two main barriers. One is just cost. And here I'm talking about the everything cost. Buying DCS, buying assets, packs, maps, modules, hardware, a PC that's going to run it well. It's not just a matter of downloading DCS and using the mouse and keyboard, which is possible. And DCS in the past have explicitly stated on a number of occasions that you can play DCS with mouse and keyboard. Yes, strictly that's true. But I think it's, yeah. I mean, if we're really honest and we kind of think about what most people expect, it's not really an engaging, and you're not getting half of what you can out of the product with a mouse and keyboard. You really need to have hardware which is ergonomic and physiologically sensible, and that's going to run the game well, looking good, and with good, frame rates and all the rest of it, stable and whatnot. So the first barrier to entry, without doubt, is cost. On the other hand, I think most people that have got that far as to be seriously interested in DCS are probably not people, and I could be assuming too much here, but are probably not people who are unwilling to invest the time and money in it. Even on some of the competing products, most people are already spending a lot of money on hardware for a start.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like to build a good DCS rig, it's, depending on how much you already have, it could be anywhere from $800 to $2,000.
Yeah, yep, absolutely agree. And I think most combat flight simmers already have that. So guys who are playing, let's say IL-2, Great Battles, guys who are building rigs to run the aviation sims even at the kind of top end, they all have these kind of rigs already. So for that audience, there's no real financial barrier to entry at that level. The next barrier to entry is this idea of how many aircraft can I get for my dollar. This is the variety argument. My personal approach is it doesn't bother me because I am not interested in flying 15 or 20 different types. I've spent 4 years flying the Spitfire, just the one type. And if I fly another sim, when I was flying Cliffs of Dover, I basically flew the Spitfire 1A, occasionally the Hurricane. I've flown a bit of Great Battles, and pretty much if I do jump in and grab an aircraft, I look for a Spitfire, a Mark 9. Yep. So, for me, you could throw 150,000 airplanes at me. I'm probably going to fly the Spitfire.
Yep.
So the variety argument doesn't work on me, which is also why DCS's approach absolutely does work on me. I'm a sucker for that. Give me one airplane. I want to fly it lots and lots and lots. I want to get really good at it, and I want to feel like I'm wearing the thing. But for other people, it's not the same. Other people want lots of variety for the same price. And I think... I don't think there's a recognition of these two different approaches. I think people making the argument that variety is what matters assume that everybody else sits in the same boat as them. People making the argument that specificity is what matters often also are ignoring the fact that other people actually don't really care about that.
No, I think you've nailed it on the head. Like that is kind of the dividing line. If you, at least in my mind, if you want the one aircraft with the specificity, as you're saying, the study level, you can push every button, you can pull every lever, you really get to know the innards of that aircraft and how it operates. That's what DCS in general and DCS World War II certainly does to that extreme level, I think, right? Like I don't think there's anything else that kind of brings it together in that way, and then has the combat. And then for the folks who they want to fly a little bit of Spitfire and they want to fly a little bit of something else, then DCS World War II doesn't do as well, and something like IL-2 Great Battles fills that niche extremely well, right? Like you have that kind of back and forth. That's why I struggle sometimes when someone says, well, which is better? Well, and I hate that argument, right? Like, because it depends on what you want. Do you want one airplane that's just magnificent in the detail, or do you want, 10 aircraft that are still very good in detail, but they don't have that sort of extreme, attention to each individual little piece, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the difference, and it comes down to what customers want to do. I think the same argument, and I see it developing now already with Microsoft Flight Simulator, the new one that's proposed. Right, I look on their page, and I see they've got 3 different customer options: a normal, a premium, and a deluxe, or whatever. I don't know what terms they use. One has X number of aircraft, one has X plus 5, and one has X plus 10. And I'm looking at the X plus 10. I'm like, okay, so I spend another €30 and I get 3 times the number of airplanes. But I'm just going to fly the Cessna. And the Cessna is in the first group. I only got to pay for the cheap one. I get the aircraft that I use when I'm flying a civilian aviation sim, which is just tootling around doing GA stuff in a Cessna. That's all I want to do. So you've got me with the cheapest option. I don't care about having 50 or 60 different airplanes. I just want to fly this one. I want to know it and learn it and have fun with it. So there we go. So the same mentality for me crosses over into civilian sims, and even first-person shooters. I play a lot of post-scriptum, but there's pretty much 1 or 2 roles I focus on. There are, I don't know, 10 or 15 different roles you can take, and you can be a machine gunner or anti-tank or whatever. I pretty much just take 1 or 2 roles, and I just like focusing on 1 or 2 things. So I think it's a mentality thing. Different people just have different mentalities, and I'm one of those people that's got a rather focused approach to my entertainment.
Sure.
So.
And that's what, DCS World War II does extremely well, is that very focused approach, the study level, if you will, on their aircraft. So other barriers, other challenges. I know you talked about what Combined Arms has kind of done for the sim, and I think some of it's positive and some of it might be skewing kind of things in a certain direction. What do you think?
Okay, so Combined Arms fits into a broader, I think, not problem or issue, but a broader kind of philosophy. There are 4, I was thinking about this before we chatted, because I know you kind of gave me a bit of a heads up about the topic areas we would discuss, which is good. It gave me a chance to think about this, because I think it's good to try and be concise, or to try and framework this kind of question, right? Everybody out there knows that DCS has got issues, and often we end up just kind of like pointing at individual pieces and go, fix this, change this, and it just becomes this big ball of interconnected requests for new features and changes. So I tried to kind of boil down my hopes, expectations, or whatever you want to call it for DCS, where I think it can improve. And I've kind of got 4 areas. I'll say them all, and then I'll go through them, and we can talk about them. So the first one I'm calling like a cohort focus, which is about matching units that historically belong together. The second one is what I'm calling a materiality focus. That is focusing on the parts of the game which directly interact with aviation. The third is damage modeling. Say no more. And the fourth is actually multiplayer. So because that's personally for me, my wish. So starting with cohort focus. DCS World War II right from the start, and I think even DCS broadly with its jet family, has gone for an approach which is incredibly broad. Some would say too broad. Some would say that when DCS decided to go with World War II, that was its gravest mistake. It should never have done it. It should have stayed in the jet age and not gone to World War II. If you'd asked me before I moved over to DCS, I would have said the same thing. Now that I'm there, thank God they did, because I love it. And I only got really into DCS World War II through the jets. I've got that around the wrong way. I only bought jet models in DCS because I came in through the World War II door. So I've bought jets. I don't fly them so often, but I own the Sabre, and I own the F5, and I own the Viggen. So I've bought 3 jet models because I came in through the World War II door. So the kind of the barrier between DCS jets and DCS World War II is pretty fuzzy. It's not as hard as some people would like us to believe. But that said, I do think DCS needs to to focus, especially when you're talking about the Second World War, on cohorts of aeroplanes. It is difficult to have what is effectively a late 1943 Spitfire operating alongside a late 1944 109, for example. Now, I know they did fly in the air at the same time, but not primarily. And so there are cohorts of aircraft that existed during the war. There are times during the war when the primary numerical set on one side, let's say we're talking about early 1944, the Luftwaffe are flying primarily the G6, the 109 G6, and Focke-Wulf F8 and A8 190s, around that, okay? So they're kind of their frontline main fighters. The other types are in service, some older types and some newer types are arriving, but if you kind of did a count, right, you drew your bar graph, that's where your biggest bar is going to lie. So I think I would like to see DCS ignoring third parties, because I think third parties should be given freedom just to make whatever bloomin' module they want. Crazy stuff is on the cards. But for DCS itself, they should try and narrow their kind of cohort. Now this, if they were to do this, that means the next aircraft they produce should be the 109 G6, to my mind. And then I would like to see the F8 190, which they've talked about on a number of occasions, but we don't really know how or when that's happening. And then the Mosquito. So that's the order I would rather see than the Mozzie, and then who knows.
No, I think that is the biggest issue that I had with DCS World War II was the cohort, the sets of aircraft, because in World War II, I mean, the difference of 6 months can change the types of aircraft involved and change the performance to such a degree that, like it just changes the whole way that you approach air combat. And so, having as you say, a late 1943, early 1944 Spitfire, but then have it face 109s that effectively were around, more in the 1945 time period, it was challenging for me.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I think it's a challenge that server operators have to deal with, because you've always got... It's tough enough when you've got a cohort that already exists and people are asking you, add this one, add this one. I mean, it's at the point, sometimes I think, you know what, we've got these late 1944 aircraft operating on what's supposed to be a Normandy scenario. Why don't we just throw the F-86 Sabre in as well? But you can't do that. Well, it would be standing in for the Gloucester Meteor. Now, the Gloucester Meteor was already operational, so we need a jet. So the Sabre's the only one we've got, so let's put it in. I mean, it's a ridiculous suggestion, of course. It's never going to happen. But you start feeling a bit that way sometimes, because the tools available to you to kind of get that cohort in place aren't yet there. So you're making adjustments anyway to kind of shoehorn the plane set in. So if you're going to be shoehorning anyway, why not just go over the top and be ridiculous about it? Of course, no one wants to play on that server, but...
Now, I have heard that there were rumblings that they may be doing a G6. And frankly, it wouldn't be, in my mind, a huge departure from what they've already sort of done with the K4, and that there's tons of other examples of G6s in flight sim. So I can't see that being a huge problem. There's a couple that still exist. I think there's even a couple of pretty close models that fly, I feel like they could do that. And I was very encouraged when the A8 came to DCS.
Yeah.
Like, that was actually the point where I said, okay, now I feel like they're starting to focus in on that kind of Normandy time period, and not quite perfectly, but they're getting there. Yeah, I think that's good.
The A8 was a great move. I had never bought a German aircraft module before. I bought the A8. And I only just started really flying it seriously in July of this year. It is amazing. That aircraft has convinced me to fly more German aircraft. It's such a cool machine. It's just fantastic. The way it's so different from flying the Spitfire, but what it does really well. And it's a bit of an underdog. because it's still competing against some pretty impressive machines. But if you fly it right, if you take your time, if you're careful, then you can have a lot of fun and do really well in that aeroplane. I think it's a great machine. So yeah, this whole cohort thing. I understand as well the G6 is going to be developed. I've seen a couple of ED people say yes, a G6 will be done, but who knows when. Sometime, 2 weeks. Yeah. So materiality is the next one. And this is where combined arms, for me, still has a lot of value. We recently realized that we could deploy combined arms on the server for this JTAC stuff. And we've also realized that you can place certain objects on the server where, for example, there's a fire control bunker. It's a concrete bunker. And you can allow people with combined arms to sit in that bunker. Now, if you place the bunker on an airfield and you have external views turned off on the airfield, someone can spawn in that bunker and they can actually observe the airfield from the bunker. So it's pretty much exactly like sitting in a control tower on the airfield. But you don't have to enable external views. So they're still locked in. They can't basically cheat and jump around the map and see everything. But they have the 3D view of the airfield and they can direct airplanes around just like ATC would. So that was our first kind of like, hold on a minute, this combined arm things is pretty sensible. Then we see that you can also use some certain flat guns. You can also then potentially, if they thought about this a bit more, they could focus combined arms on the ground units that interact directly with aviation. So we're talking about flat guns, airfield infrastructure such as watchtowers, control towers, and then maybe some kind of forward controller role, like a fighter controller who has a jeep or something, who can move around on the ground and direct air combat into targets, similar to what you see with, modern guys using lasers and whatnot, except it would be just binoculars and go left, go right kind of thing.
Sure. Well, and those were the original, the original JTAC, right? Before they called it JTAC.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So originally you had fighter controllers, and the Battle of Britain's a good example of this. Directing the defense around, and then as developed furthermore and the radios became smaller and more mobile, then they were able to deploy those guys into jeeps who would drive along near the troops and direct air attacks from the ground. So yeah, all this stuff is historically possible, and that's where I think combined arms should go. And I'm not just talking about World War II here. I think the same philosophy would probably be embraced by the people who fly jets as well, is that combined arms currently tries to be a ground war thing. And I think it's a distraction in terms of effort and in terms of focus. What I think they should do is say, yeah, it's ground war, but it's only those elements of the ground war which are directly relevant and directly relate to the air war, which is what DCS is about. So that's why the carrier stuff is so cool. Because they've done this on the carriers, right? They've said, okay, we've got aircraft carriers. We're going to implement systems where the people who play DCS can jump into the certain roles on the carrier, which directly relate to the air war, and then they can interact with people who are flying from the carrier. They've realized there's a connection there. This then further goes on to multi-crew aircraft for me. So I think combined arms should be the vehicle by which people can then crew aircraft when they're not the pilot.
Right. So we're talking like your gunners, bombardier.
Gunners, bombardier, navigator. That's the sort of stuff. If DCS goes down that route of multi-crew, I think combined arms should be the vehicle for getting there. And pull combined arms away from this tank v tank, whatever stuff, which pretty much no one uses unless they're making YouTube videos, and actually make combined arms much more meaningful, focusing it on the interactions with aviation.
Yeah.
So number 3, damage model. I don't need to talk about this. I think everybody in the world of combat aviation knows that the DCS damage model for a long time has suffered for being far too simplistic. They are now beta testing the new DM, And it seems like, certainly on the effects side, parts of it have already started being implemented. Anyone who's played DCS in the last 4 months or last 3 months is commenting on, this looks new, I've never seen this before, new smoke effects, new bullet hit effects, new fire effects, aircraft doing stuff in the air when hit they never used to do, props bending, props breaking, all this kind of stuff has started showing up in the last couple of months. There's not been any official statement from ED saying yes or no. They seem pretty reticent to... now, whether that's because the stuff is slipping through unintentionally or not, or whether stuff is being kind of tested, or the exact reasons why what is happening are unknown. However, it's definitely changing. And I think we're on the cusp of that, of the new DM. I don't think it has to be perfect or amazing. I think it just has to be good, and I just think it has to be convincing enough. Because for most people, when you're flying around, and I don't know how many times you've seen this, but like you're flying around and you shoot someone, or someone shoots someone and something does or does not happen, and then people get into these kind of wars on the chat. I emptied my entire ammunition into you and you didn't go down, or blah, blah, blah. Most people have no idea how often they miss. We keep pretty accurate stats on shooting accuracy on our website, and we did the same in Cliffs of Dover. So got about 60 years of multiplayer experience of people shooting and how accurate they are. Most people, the very best pilots online, have about a 15 to 20% accuracy with their shooting.
And that's actually pretty good.
Yeah, that's the very best. They're the super accurate aces. Most people have about a 3 to 5% accuracy on their shooting. Almost everything you shoot is missing almost all of the time. And people don't really know how much they're missing, because they're only really thinking about the stuff that hits rather than the huge volumes of lead that just flies around the air.
For sure. Yes, and we see that in more than one sim. Like that has been something, IL-2 1946 and Forgotten Battles and IL-2 Great Battles and DCS World, and like on it goes, right?
It's always been the way. That's just how it happens. So I don't think the damage model needs to be perfect. I don't think they need to model, every single specific landing point of every bullet hitting every possible piece of interior of the airplane, because I think if you go to that, you're going to kill anyone's PC. I don't think it's possible to really model all of those projectiles with all of those different masses and all those different materials hitting all those other different materials, all going in different directions with different angles and different receiving speeds. It's just not possible. So you just have to come up with something that is relatively sensible. And I have confidence that they will. I have no doubt that when it is released, there's going to be a long period of everyone complaining very heavily about it. Either it's too easy to get shot down, when it's me, of course. It's too difficult to shoot someone down when it's them. And that'll just be the first reaction. If not the first reaction might be, wow, this is amazing. I'm seeing all this new stuff for the first time. But then their expectations of how good they are personally will start being challenged by what they're seeing again, and the complaints will roll in. So
yeah. And it'll take a little while, and then people get used to it, and then they'll tweak it, and the cycle will continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that said, they do need this new DM. And 2 years ago, ideally, but it is what it is.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
The last thing I think for me is a multiplayer focus. Now, I'm under the understanding, and I think Eagle Dynamics have said this on a number of occasions, that by far their biggest customer base is the single player, not the multiplayer people. I don't know what the ratios are, but it must be a substantial weight in favor of people who don't use multiplayer.
Yeah, I've heard numbers quoted like it's 90% single player, 10% multiplayer. I wonder if it's a little bit more even, like maybe it's 70-30, but in any case, it does seem to be a huge collection of people doing single player. Absolutely.
Yeah. Currently, much more stuff works in single player than it does in multiplayer.
Right.
And I wonder, I'm speculating, I don't know, but I wonder if DCS's focus on single player environment means that once they've got something working in single player, their interest in further ensuring its functioning in multiplayer is perhaps less than I would like it to be. A couple of examples, if we want concretes. One is the clouds. The clouds don't synchronize in multiplayer, right? So in single player, it doesn't matter. You're the only person that sees them. In multiplayer, one person can be flying into a cloud, and for another person, there's no cloud there. Everybody else has pretty much dealt with this problem. IL-2 doesn't have this problem. Claude doesn't have this problem.
Even IL-2 1946 had synchronized clouds.
Even 1946, yeah.
Yeah, I was a bit flabbergasted that they...
That is pretty shocking.
Yeah.
And now I don't think it's the DCS can't do it. I think they could do it. And I would even propose some very, very simplistic solutions for this. I don't think they need to go and develop some fully complicated, multi-layered, dynamic cloud system that's based on, actual winds and temperatures and humidity, and precipitation only occurs when the right atmospheric conditions are met. I don't think they need to go down that path. But they basically need to make it so that whatever one player sees, somebody else sees as well.
Yeah.
And it bugs me that they haven't done that. What it means is that people don't see the stuff they've already made, which is a first disappointment. But it also, I think, means that it limits the amount of environments that we can deploy on the multiplayer servers. I've just decided to go ahead and put clouds in. I've just thought, stuff it. I got sick of flying around in clear blue skies on every server, day after day after day. Always midday, bright blue sky. It's just boring. So I thought, I'm just going to put the clouds in. I don't care anymore. People are going to just have to deal with the fact that someone else might not see them, and they might not see someone else because they're in a cloud. Just fly away from the clouds, if that's going to happen. And it's just one of the problems with DCS that we currently have to live with. Hopefully they'll deal with it. But it's not just about clouds, and I think it goes back to this kind of a wider philosophy, and I'd love to see them focus more on multiplayer. There are a number of things like the clouds which don't work. One of my bugbears is barrage balloons. So if you put barrage balloons, they're fine in single player. You can have barrage balloons, you can see them. They don't show for clients in multiplayer.
Oh, you're kidding.
So on our server, we have barrage balloons attached to ships, on ports, railway stations. They're there, just no one can see them. I'm the only person who's ever seen them because I make the missions on my PC.
Right.
So they're all there. It's just no one ever gets to see them.
So
the other one is
show. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. The other one is trains, right? There are trains in DCS. They're quite nicely modeled. They look good. They're period trains. The railway lines are all there. In single player, the trains will run along the railway lines. You can go and do train busting missions, but they don't show up in multiplayer. They're invisible for clients.
Oh, wow. That's something else I didn't know. That's interesting.
Yeah. So these things, they've gone to all this effort. They've coded this stuff. They've designed it. They've added it to their sim. And there's a whole portion of their customer base who never sees it because we are focused on multiplayer. Now, is this not a priority because they have a focus on single player? Has it slipped through? Are they unaware? I don't know what the reasons are for them not having dealt with these issues, but they are long-standing problems. And for me, all I can suggest is it's just they're not as focused on the multiplayer stuff. So
yeah, although I am getting, again, the sense that since Nick Gray has been more involved, that they have started to recognize that there are more people playing multiplayer maybe than they assumed, or that certainly the multiplayer group is a very engaged player base that they may need to pay more attention to. I get the sense that there's been a bit of a change, but that like any organization or any big project, it takes time to kind of change the direction, to steer the ship a little differently. I don't know. Do you feel the same way, or?
Yeah, I occasionally get the feeling that there's a recognition or a change in philosophy until it happens. I mean, we've raised these bugs on the forums for a number of years, so I will be very, very vocal in my support when it's done. I will be absolutely promoting the shit out of it when it arrives. I will make sure that I use this stuff. It's on the server, that there are clouds for people to fly through, that there are trains, there are missions with trains, the barrage balloons are all there. I will make sure it's there and it's working and it looks amazing. I will make YouTube videos about it when it's working and it's there. So I'll give them the praise when the product is in my hands.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, we need more than just the ship is turning. We need it to actually turn.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
To see the fruits of that. So
I think because of the channel being quite focused on YouTube and having it's a small niche channel anyway, but there are a few people that watch the videos. I think people sometimes get the impression that I'm a fan of DCS. I don't really like to use that word fan. I still see myself very much as a customer. I've paid for entertainment. I currently am entertained by it. I would like to get more value from my payment. And as and when I feel like I'm not getting value for the money I'm spending, I stop spending more money. So I see myself very much as having a producer or a supplier-customer relationship with DCS and with Eagle Dynamics. And I want to maintain that. I kind of hope that comes through in my YouTube videos, but sometimes I think because I'm so heavily focused, obviously, on DCS content, it looks like I'm perhaps more of a fan than I am. I try to keep myself as much as a customer, as a consumer.
Sure. Well, yeah, I do. I try and do that too. And I think it's, when you have a platform like a YouTube channel, or in my case, a blog and a podcast now, yeah, I think it's kind of, I see my role as kind of being, I am a consumer along with the rest of you. And, when I do a review, I try and give people like, this is what this product or this module or package or whatever provides you. And this is my take on it as a consumer of it.
Yeah.
And, if you see things the way that I do, then, this content might be for you, or you might see something that I wrote about and clearly it's not for you. But in either case, I'm trying to help people kind of figure out if, this is the right content. And I don't know, I think that's what you do with your channel, right? Like, you show off the things that you're doing, and if someone watches your video and goes, yeah, I want to do that, then that's what you've done, right?
Yeah. The hardest part is when reviewing something. So I think for me, this is not really a problem, but a luxury, I guess, that you have, because you can't, or you're currently not, just playing the game and showing people you playing, right? You're not just showcasing something, which is a bit more difficult when you're writing about a product. So that's the easy part, right? Just playing the game, editing the video, editing the gameplay footage and uploading it. That's the easier part. The harder part is reviewing, which is something you do much more regularly than I do, and is actually thinking critical about a product and taking account of your demands or your interests, and potentially the interests or demands of other people who are reading, participating with your review. The only way I've found around that dilemma is try to be really explicit about my methodology. So to be really clear, what aspects of this am I going to be covering? Where am I limited? Where can I speculate? And try and be really honest about those. Like, this is me speculating. This is me showcasing. This is me expressing a wish for change. And trying to be as honest and methodical about that process, because I think that's the only way you can be transparent.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the way to do it. Like, you kind of have to just say, this is where I'm coming from. These are the things that, obviously stood out to me, pro, con, whatever. I try in my reviews, and whenever I'm looking at something, to pull myself back a little bit and go, okay, so this is how I see it, or this is the way I'm interested in it. Is someone else going to see it in a different way? Can I try and speak to them in some way, and say, hey, maybe I don't like this as much, but if you like it in this other way, you might actually like it quite a bit more than me. Like, I try and do that too. It's a tough, line to it's not a line, but it's like it's a tough area to kind of traverse, right?
Yeah, the expectations of others, and I think when you're doing reviews, you've got all this history of seeing people's comments about stuff in the past, and all of those comments are sort of flooding around in the back of your mind. I can't say this because I know what's going to come back at me as a result. So you try to use some sort of diplomatic language. You try to steer the response away from certain topics by anticipating. It's not easy. To try and just keep the commentary or your own commentary just focused on a limited set of observations, with then saying, and this is how I feel about it, and kind of then just offering that up to the masses or to the friends, or your other colleagues and friends and mates or whatever who
For sure.
read your stuff. And so
Well, Phil, this has been a great conversation about DCS World War II, DCS and flight sims in general. I think we've had a great conversation. Anything you want to kind of leave as a last thought?
Not really. I mean, I think at the moment most people know that DCS World War II is improving. It's probably on the cusp, I think, of really establishing itself formally as a, I'm not going to use the word leading, but formally as a competitive player in the DCS, in the World War II flight simming market. But stuff is changing so quickly right now. And, Microsoft Flight Simulator is just around the corner. Those guys have money to throw. Who knows what's going to happen in 2 years? I think being a flight sim developer now must be a pretty scary kind of situation. And I think everybody is probably thinking, like, what is our core business? Are we going to focus on our core business, or are we going to try and branch out and try new things? And both of those approaches are pretty fraught with both dangers and possibilities. So yeah, from the customer's perspective, it's probably a pretty good place right now.
For sure.
But you never know. You never know. In the end, it's entertainment, right? We do it because it's fun. And for me, if this started becoming not fun, I would just pack it in and go mow the lawn. So.
All right. Well, we will end it on that note. Thank you, Phil, for being on the podcast. And thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you as well. Thanks very much.